There are cities that exist in two versions, the version before and the version after. San Francisco is one of those cities, and the line between those two versions was drawn at 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, 1906, when the ground beneath the city moved in a way that nobody who felt it ever forgot, and many who felt it did not survive to remember. What happened in San Francisco over the 4 days that followed is one of the most documented disasters in American history. Thousands of photographs survived. Hundreds of first-hand accounts were written down, some immediately, some decades later when the writers were old enough to understand what they had lived through. The city itself was rebuilt so quickly and so completely that within a few years you could walk its streets and find almost no physical evidence that anything had happened at all. But the story underneath the official one is more complicated and in some ways more honest about what cities are, what they're built on, and what gets lost when they burn. San Francisco in April of 1906 was 30 years into its second life. The first life had ended with the gold rush. The city that exploded into existence in 1849 and 1850 was a chaotic, improvised place, built fast by people who weren't planning to stay, full of wooden buildings thrown up in weeks on steep hillsides above a bay that everyone agreed was one of the most beautiful natural harbours in the world. That city had burned 6 times in 18 months, between 1849 and 1851. Each time it burned, it was rebuilt faster than before. By 1906, the city had grown into something more permanent and more self-conscious. The population was somewhere around 400,000 people. The waterfront was busy with ships from Asia, from South America, from everywhere. The financial district had real buildings, stone and brick, the kind of buildings that suggested the city intended to be there for a long time. There were theatres, restaurants, newspapers, a Chinatown that was the largest Chinese community outside of Asia, neighbourhoods full of Victorian houses climbing up hills that gave extraordinary views of the bay. The city understood itself as the great city of the American West, not a frontier town anymore, not a temporary camp, but a real place with a real future. Under all of it ran the Hayward and San Andreas fault lines. This was not a secret. The region had experienced earthquakes before. The geological reality of the Bay Area was visible to anyone who looked at the landscape with serious attention. But the relationship between knowing a risk exists and acting on that knowledge is more complicated than it sounds, especially when acting on it would be expensive and inconvenient, and the risk has not materialized recently enough to feel urgent. The city's water infrastructure was inadequate for a major fire. This was documented. Engineers had written reports. The reports had been received by city officials. The city continued to grow, and the water system continued to be what it was. On the evening of April 17th, the city went about its ordinary business. At the Opera House, Enrico Caruso was performing in Carmen. He was one of the most famous singers in the world, and the performance that night was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The audience included much of the city's social elite. Caruso, who was staying at the Palace Hotel, went to bed that night in one of the finest rooms in one of the finest hotels west of Chicago. In the working-class neighborhood south of Market Street, families went to bed in wooden houses that had been standing for 20 or 30 years. Fishermen along the waterfront were preparing for the early morning. Bakers were starting their overnight shifts. The city that never entirely sleeps was doing what it always did in the hours before dawn. At the Mechanics Pavilion, a large arena near City Hall, the night shift was quiet. None of these people knew that 14 miles beneath the surface of the Earth, stress that had been accumulating along the San Andreas Fault for decades was about to release all at once, along a rupture that would eventually extend nearly 300 miles. The earthquake struck at 5:12 and 6 seconds in the morning. The shaking lasted between 45 and 60 seconds, depending on which account you read. For people who lived through it, the estimates range wildly, because time behaves strangely when the ground is moving. Some survivors described it as less than a minute, some described it as several minutes. What they agreed on was the sound, a deep, sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the motion, not a single jolt but a rolling, twisting movement that made standing impossible. Buildings that had seemed permanent revealed themselves as provisional. Unreinforced brick structures, which represented a large portion of the city's commercial building stock, collapsed almost immediately. The shaking knocked chimneys off houses across the city, which, in a city full of wood-burning stoves, was the beginning of the fire problem before the shaking had even stopped. City Hall, which had taken 20 years and $6 million to build, lost most of its facade in the first seconds. The dome remained standing over a skeleton of steel and rubble that made the building look like a ruin from ancient Rome. Photographs of it taken later that day are among the most haunting images from the disaster, because the dome, continuing to stand over the wreckage, seemed to insist on something that the wreckage itself was contradicting. The Palace Hotel, where Caruso was sleeping, survived the earthquake itself with relatively minor structural damage. He reportedly dressed quickly and went out into the street, where he stood looking at the damage and, according to his own account, said something in Italian that translates roughly to, "The earth doesn't want me here anymore." He left San Francisco on the first available transportation and never returned. Within 30 minutes of the earthquake, the fires had started. The earthquake had broken gas mains across the city. It had knocked over wood stoves and fireplaces. It had shorted electrical wiring. The combination produced ignition points in dozens of locations simultaneously, and the fires began to grow. Under ordinary circumstances, a city fire department could have contained most of them, but the earthquake had also broken the water mains. When firefighters arrived and connected their hoses to the hydrants, the pressure was insufficient or absent entirely. The water simply wasn't there. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had understood this problem for years. He had been requesting funding for a saltwater pumping system that would allow firefighters to draw water directly from the bay, regardless of the condition of the freshwater system. The request had been made, acknowledged, and not funded. Sullivan himself was critically injured in the first minutes of the earthquake, when a chimney from an adjacent building crashed through the roof of the fire station where he was sleeping. He died 4 days later, without regaining consciousness.
Cuba had been fighting for independence from Spain for years. Puerto Rico and the Philippines were still Spanish colonies. Most Americans sympathized with the Cuban revolutionaries, and when an American warship exploded in Havana Harbor, under circumstances that have never been fully explained, public pressure for war became overwhelming. The US told Spain to leave Cuba. Spain declared war instead. It lasted about 4 months. The United States took Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. What remained of the Spanish Empire that Columbus had started building 400 years earlier was effectively finished. Theodore Roosevelt became president after yet another assassination, the third in 35 years, and brought an energy and aggression to the office that reshaped American foreign policy. He wanted a canal across Panama to allow the US Navy to move quickly between oceans. When Colombia, which controlled the territory, backed out of the deal at the last minute, the Americans quietly encouraged Panama to declare independence from Colombia. Panama did. The canal negotiations proceeded. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914, the same year World War I began. In a little over a century, the United States had gone from a narrow strip of struggling colonies on the eastern coast of a continent that Europe had mostly ignored for 100 years to the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, with territory spanning 2 oceans, a navy that could project force globally, and an economy that was already becoming the largest in the world. It hadn't been inevitable. It had been a combination of extraordinary geography, extraordinary luck, extraordinary violence, and a series of decisions by people all over the world. Napoleon, various Spanish and Mexican governments, the Russian Tsar, a handful of Colombian negotiators who changed their minds at the wrong moment. That happened to break in America's favor again and again. The story of how a country gets from nothing to everything in 130 years is rarely as clean as it looks on a map. But the map at least shows you where things ended up, and where they ended up by 1914 was everywhere. I think about the people who built Chartres. They raised a structure in 26 years that has stood for 8 centuries. The nave is 121 feet high. The walls are almost entirely glass, held in place by stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function without modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, and centuries of French weather. When modern engineers have studied it, they found tolerances in the stonework that rival 20th century construction standards. The builders didn't have computers or laser levels. They had geometry passed down through the guild, practical knowledge accumulated over centuries, and they built something that measurably changed the state of every human body that entered it. Through sound, through light,
through chemistry, through proportions that the nervous system registers even when the conscious mind doesn't notice. We have lost the ability to build what they built. Not because we lack the tools, we have tools they never imagined. We've lost it because we dismantled the knowledge system that made it possible. The 7-year apprenticeship that transmitted empirical observation across generations, the guild that held the accumulated understanding of how materials behaved, how sound moved through stone, how light changed across different seasons, the connection between the builder and the building that came from a lifetime spent inside both. When the guild system was dismantled and replaced with wage labour, with patents, with the factory model of production, something was lost that we haven't replaced. We can measure the frequencies inside Sharch now. We can analyse the glass with spectrometers. We can confirm that the building does what the builders intended it to do, but we cannot make another one. The knowledge of how to make another one died in the suppression of the guilds, 2 centuries before we had the instruments to understand what we had lost. My friend visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes measuring. Then she put down the equipment and sat in one of the wooden chairs and didn't say anything for a long time. When she came out, she said, "Whatever they were doing, it works." The chair was solid and heavy and very old and still perfectly level, and the questions remain. Why do the acoustic properties of a building constructed in the 12th century match the specifications that modern neurologists would design if asked to create an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce these effects held in a guild system that was systematically dismantled by the same governments that were simultaneously centralising control over currency, land, and labour? Why do we describe the result as a church, and not as what the acoustic measurements confirm it actually was, a machine for healing, one we don't know how to build anymore, because we destroyed the people who knew?
She described talking to other survivors years after the earthquake, and finding in those conversations a shared quality that she had difficulty naming. Not trauma exactly, not grief exactly, more like a recalibration, a permanent adjustment in how they understood the relationship between the city they lived in and the ground it stood on. There were also people who simply didn't talk about it, who moved on, who rebuilt, who raised children in the new city without saying much about the old one. This was not unusual in the early 20th century, which had a different relationship with what we now call processing. People went back to work because the work needed to be done. They rebuilt because the alternative was not to rebuild, and not rebuilding was not something most of them were able to consider. The Chinatown question is one of the most uncomfortable threads in the history of the 1906 disaster. Chinatown, which occupied a dense neighbourhood near the financial district, was completely destroyed in the fire. The land it occupied was valuable, close to downtown, and there were proposals in the immediate aftermath of the disaster to relocate the Chinese community to a less central area of the city, or out of the city entirely. The Chinese community resisted. There were organised efforts, including diplomatic pressure from the Chinese government, which complicated the calculations of city officials who were simultaneously trying to attract foreign investment and demonstrate San Francisco's sophistication to the world. Chinatown was rebuilt in its original location, and the rebuilt version was designed partly as a deliberate statement, incorporating architectural elements intended to make it visually appealing to non-Chinese visitors in ways the original had not been. This was a compromise that served multiple interests simultaneously and satisfied none of them entirely. The Chinese community maintained its presence in the city, but on terms that had been shaped by the emergency and by the negotiations of the Reconstruction period. The story of that negotiation is not one that gets told very often in the official commemorations of the disaster. April 18, 1906, falls on a Wednesday this year. Every year on that date, a small group of survivors and descendants gathers in Lotter's Fountain, a cast-iron fountain at the corner of Market and Kearney Streets that was one of the meeting places used by displaced residents looking for missing family members in the days after the earthquake. The fountain survived. It became a landmark not because of what it was, but because of what had happened around it. The gathering is small. The survivors are long gone. The descendants who come are there because of stories they were told, memories passed down through families, the specific texture of what was lost and what was rebuilt, transmitted person to person across a century. San Francisco is a different city now than it was in 1906. It has been rebuilt multiple times since then, in the ways that cities are constantly rebuilt. New buildings replacing old ones, neighborhoods changing their character, the waterfront transformed, the hills crowned with different structures. The bay is still there. The fault lines are still there. The last major earthquake to strike the city was in October 1989, during the World Series, when 63 people died and a section of the Bay Bridge collapsed and the elevated freeway along the Embarcadero fell, killing the people who were driving on it. Photographs from that night show fires burning in the Marina District, in buildings constructed on bay fill that liquefied in the shaking, the same geological dynamics that had amplified the 1906 earthquake playing out again in a different neighborhood with different buildings. The city rebuilt again. It always has. There's a photograph taken on April 18, 1906, from the top of a hill in the Noe Valley neighborhood, looking north across the city toward the bay. It was taken sometime in the mid-morning, after the earthquake, but while the fires were still relatively contained. The city in the photograph looks mostly intact. You can see the familiar outline of the hills, the bay in the background, the rooftops of thousands of buildings. A few columns of smoke are rising from the distance, but they don't dominate the frame. The city looks, in this photograph, essentially normal. 4 days later, the same view would have shown almost nothing but ash and standing chimneys for miles. I think about that photograph sometimes when I think about what cities are. The way they look permanent when they are not. The way they feel eternal when they are made of the same materials as everything else. Wood and brick and glass and the complicated lives of the people who fill them. The way the ground underneath them carries its own history, its own accumulated stress, its own occasional need to move. San Francisco rebuilt itself because its people needed somewhere to live, and because the bay was still one of the most beautiful natural harbours in the world, and because leaving was harder than staying for most of the 400,000 people who had been there when the ground moved on a Wednesday morning in April. They stayed. They built. They tried to build better than what had been there before, with mixed success, as people always do. The ground is quiet tonight. It has been quiet for a while now, but the fault lines are still there, running under the streets and the houses and the lives that have been built over them, patient in the way that geology is patient, which is to say, completely indifferent to what human beings need the timeline to be. The city knows this. It has always known this. It builds anyway. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing you can say about San Francisco. Not that it is fearless, because it isn't. Not that it has solved the problem of living on unstable ground, because it hasn't. But that it has looked clearly at the ground it stands on and decided, each time the question is asked, that this is still the place it wants to be. Sleep well. The bay is still there. The hills are still there. And the ground, for now, is still.